So today I want to go over why I think a lot of people are leveling up wrong, and to also go into what I think is the most efficient way to be leveling up while you're in the end game. And this is going to be specifically for people in the end game, so level 50 to level 100. So one of the main ways I see a lot of people trying to level up is to go into World Tier 4, find a dungeon with a really high mob density or a lot of elites at the starting portion of the dungeon, then they go in, clear that out, reset the dungeon, rinse and repeat. Now don't get me wrong, that is still a pretty decent way to level up. I've even gone over some videos showing some of the best dungeons to do this in, but I don't think that is even close to the most efficient way to be leveling up. And one of the main reasons being that Blizzard has been nerfing all the best dungeons to do this with, generally meaning that this strategy of leveling up is much less efficient than it was even a few days ago. But there's another way you can run dungeons that's going to be incredibly strong for just leveling up, but that's also going to progress your character much more than just running normal dungeons ever could. And this is pretty simply to just run nightmare dungeons. But there's a lot of pieces of information you need to know to be able to optimize nightmare dungeons to earn the most amount of XP you possibly can and to get the most out of running nightmare dungeons that you possibly can. Now, the first and most important thing you need to know about nightmare dungeons is how nightmare sigils are going to scale the enemy levels in that dungeon. Because if you didn't know, higher level enemies actually give you more experience than enemies of your own level. And this caps out when an enemy is 3 levels above you, and that's going to give you an increase of 25% experience. So when you're running nightmare dungeons, you're always going to want to be killing enemies that are 3 levels above you. This is going to be the sweet spot, because if they're 4 levels above you, you're not getting any increased experience, but they're taking longer to kill. So you want all enemies 3 levels above you. And you're able to guarantee this in every nightmare dungeon, because how nightmare sigils scale enemy levels is you add 54 levels onto the level of the key. So if you have a level 20 nightmare sigil, add 54 on top of that, so those enemies are going to be level 74. And this is how basically every nightmare sigil is going to scale. So you can guarantee that every nightmare dungeon you run, you'll be facing enemies 3 levels above you by using the correct nightmare sigil level. So not only can you guarantee this 25% increased experience boost, but if you're a solo player, you're also going to be able to have an elixir on 100% of the time. Because if you were a solo player doing the other strategy we went over, you would have to leave the game to reset that dungeon, meaning you're always losing your elixir buff, usually meaning you're probably not going to use one. So just the elixir and being able to guarantee enemies are 3 levels above you, you're getting 30% increased experience that you most likely wouldn't have been getting from just spam farming these normal dungeons. But you're also going to be getting another big chunk of experience for completing the nightmare dungeon. Once you complete that nightmare dungeon and the bubble pops up that lets you level up your glyphs, you're also going to be getting 2 pieces of gear, possible cosmetics, and you're going to be getting a big chunk of experience for that completion. I think a lot of people don't notice this, but once that reward pops up, you'll see an experience and a gold amount. And this experience amount is actually quite a lot. Now, like I mentioned earlier in the video, this is not only going to be incredibly strong for leveling up, but these are going to progress your character much more than any normal dungeon could. And this is primarily due to leveling up your glyphs. So once you complete the dungeon, that bubble pops up and there's a stand in the middle that allows you to level up your glyphs for your Paragon board. And if you haven't gotten into endgame build creation, glyphs are one of the strongest pieces to basically every build in the game. Leveling these things up, getting them to max level, is one of the biggest power bumps you can get from anything else in the game. And the best way to go about leveling up all your glyphs is to first get all of them to level 15, because that's going to increase their radius. Then after everything's level 15, you just start leveling them up to level 21, which is the max. And this is going to keep giving you more and more power every time you level them up to level 21. And say you have all your glyphs at level 21, the amount of power difference that gives you from, say, even having all your glyphs at level 15 is massive. This is one of the ways you see all the incredibly strong endgame builds, because they have very high level glyphs. And you wouldn't be leveling up your glyphs spamming normal dungeons. So this is another reason why running nightmare dungeons is so much more effective than just spam running normal dungeons, because they have good density. Now, when choosing what nightmare sigil to use and what dungeons to run, this is almost purely going to come down to your build and where your character is currently at. I don't think looking at a tier list is going to serve you very well, because builds in Diablo 4 work in so many different ways that certain dungeons are going to be much better for different builds than they are for others. Take, for instance, my druid build. Anytime I kill something, I gain spirit. So if there's a dungeon with a ton of tiny enemies everywhere, I'm going to have basically infinite primary resource. But if you have a build that's much better at just finding elite packs, killing those very quickly, and skipping a lot of the smaller enemies, a dungeon with tons of small spiders running around may not be as good for your build. So that's one of the primary things you're going to have to be learning when going into the Nightmare Dungeon system, what dungeons are good for your specific build. And the other thing you're going to want to look at is the afflictions on that Nightmare Dungeon sigil. Now that's the buffs that that sigil is going to give to the enemies in that dungeon. And the primary thing you're looking for is if any of those afflictions are going to impact your primary way of dealing damage. So for instance, if you have a build that has a lot of guaranteed overpower, you don't want to use any Nightmare Sigil that's going to reduce the overpower damage enemies take. If you have a build heavily based upon crit, you don't want an affliction that's going to make enemies take reduced critical damage. The Nightmare Sigils are actually very easy to read in that way. Just look if any of the afflictions are going to massively impact the damage your build deals. If there's an affliction like that on that key, get rid of that key, use a different one. So following all this information is absolutely going to be the best way to level up and progress your character in Diablo 4. So that's all I want to go over. So thanks for watching.